Ecosystem Podcast 1 Coral Reefs. Hello, I am Caden Hodges.
I'm Kelly Diaz.
And I'm Katie Johnson.
Coral is an essential element of marine biodiversity, as well as being a necessary provider of protein for people around the world. Often misconstrued for a plant or inorganic structure, coral is actually a colonial organism composed of millions of organisms. These organisms are called polyps and live in colonies that are interconnected and dependent on one another for survival, and exist symbiotically with species of algae. The part we consider to be a reef is actually their limestone exoskeletons. The importance of coral reefs is hard to overstate. 25% of all marine life is dependent on coral reefs for at least part of their life cycles. This large number of species richness makes coral reefs one of the most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet. A number of factors contribute to this biodiversity. Reefs serve to protect organisms from predators, leading to it being an attractive living space for prey creatures, as well as serving for an excellent nursery for a multitude of species. It's also important for people. As stated before, 25% of marine life is in some way dependent on coral reefs, and fishing makes up to 15% of annual protein intake for 4.3 billion people. When looking at developing nations, this is made even more clear, with reef-caught fish making up to 20 to 25% of all fish caught. The U.S. itself depends on coral reefs for its fishing industry, with half of U.S. fisheries depending on healthy coral. Additionally, in the U.S., $1.75 billion worth of ecosystem services are provided by corals, including things like employment, fisheries, and storm barriers.
All right, this is Katie Johnson, and I will be discussing global climate effects on coral. I'm going to start off with coral bleaching. As one can imagine, humans have great effects on the natural environment around them. We see this every day in our lives. Between forested areas being cleared and wetlands being drained, humans have an obvious impact on the planet, though sometimes this is more difficult to see when it comes to oceans, given that accessibility is limited to the average person. Anthropogenic effects on the environment are causing coral reefs to be considered a threatened ecosystem. Given the aforementioned descriptions of coral and their massive importance to humans and nature alike, it is pertinent that we, as a scientific community, understand the threats against them and how we can work to mitigate them. These anthropogenic effects take shape in the form of nutrient pollution and climate change, which is mainly what I'll be talking about today. Don't worry though, this barely scratches the surface. As we spoke about briefly earlier, corals have a symbiotic relationship with an algae called zoolanthe. This relationship is mutualistic, meaning that both organisms benefit from its existence. The coral provides the zoolanthe with the shelter that they need, and the coral uses the photosynthetic products of the algae, mainly carbohydrates and oxygen, to perpetuate their own survival. In addition, the algae are responsible for the coral's vibrant color. For these reasons, the zoolanthe are important to the coral's survival. When the coral becomes stressed, they will expel these algae from their tissues, hence causing them to lose their color and leaving them bleached. Stress in coral can be caused by variations in the normal abiotic conditions coral are accustomed to living in, including temperature being too high or too low, corals being exposed to too much light, nutrient pollution, and tidal abnormalities where coral may be exposed to air. I'm sure you're starting to see how global climate change can cause great stress in this way. Despite the fact that corals don't die immediately when they expel their symbiote, it can make them more susceptible to other stressors like disease, and they are only able to survive the event if conditions improve before it's too late. An adjacent issue to this is ocean acidification. As most people with any access to the internet are aware, anthropogenic global climate change is a relatively new issue in reference to geological time, and its effects can be attributed almost entirely to human action. This is mostly characterized by the rising levels of atmospheric CO2 following the Industrial Revolution, which is to cite for this shift in global climate. Comparatively, the ocean is to cite for a large amount of its mitigation. The global ocean's ability to absorb this excess atmospheric CO2, either through diffusion into the water column or uptake by photosynthetic marine organisms, has majorly saved the same human population that caused the whole catastrophe in the first place. As alluded to previously, atmospheric CO2 levels have increased from pre-industrial levels of around 280 parts per million to present levels of around 400 parts per million. This inconceivably huge amount of CO2, around 225 billion tons, has been absorbed by the ocean, causing its pH to fall from approximately 8.2 to approximately 8.1. This may seem extremely underwhelming, but we must remember that pH is on a logarithmic scale, meaning that this 0.1 decrease is about a 26% increase in acidity over 250 years. This rate is almost unprecedented. So you may be thinking to yourself, so what? Isn't it good that the ocean is doing all this work for us and mitigating climate change to some degree? And the answer is yes to some extent, though this hasn't come without a price. The increase of dissolved CO2 in the water column causes a domino effect of chemical reactions that ultimately produce carbonic acid, causing the acidification that has become a buzzword in discussions about global climate. The main marine organism that suffers these consequences are the marine calcifiers, which are organisms that build their shells and skeletons from calcium carbonate. These include corals. The more acidic conditions can cause the shells and exoskeletons to dissolve more readily and result in fewer free carbonate ions available for uptake in the water column. Carbonate ions bond with excess hydrogen atoms, which are more prevalent in acidic conditions. Carbonate ions are the major building blocks for calcification. Without them, calcifiers cannot build their necessary body parts and therefore may find it difficult to thrive in that environment. This pretty naturally leads us to the main hypothesis as to why ocean acidification endangers calcifiers so intensely compared to other marine organisms, because calcifiers have to expend extra energy to build and maintain shells and skeletons in increasingly corrosive environments. They become more susceptible to otherwise surmountable stressors like disease, rising temperatures, and high light environments.
Coral bleaching is not the only issue facing reefs. Land-based runoffs also serve as a scourge for reef growth and survival. Due to the development and the stripping of natural ecosystems on shores and river mouths, erosion has begun to occur at an accelerated pace. The simplest effect this has on the coral is that the particulates from the land physically block the sun, which results in the death of the coral. Microplastics from dissolved plastics and other man-made products can also find their way into the ocean through rainfall or rivers, leading to their consumption by aquatic life. This introduces toxins present in the plastic and can stop up their digestive tracts. Runoff from farms can contain pesticides or herbicides. These substances are detrimental to the coral's reproduction and are especially detrimental to the species of algae that exist symbiotically with the coral. Additionally, though, spiking nutrient levels in waters surrounding runoff from farms can lead to increases in algae that then proceed to produce dissolved organic carbon. This serves as a food source for damaging microbes. These microbes then deplete the oxygen in the surrounding water, resulting in coral death. This accelerates the process because the dying coral leaves more room for more algae to grow, releasing more organic carbon and allowing more microbes to spawn. However, oxygen-depleting microbes are not the only microscopic organisms that can affect corals. Runoff from sewage can introduce pathogenic bacteria and parasites that can lead to coral death through disease, especially if they're already undergoing other environmental stressors. In addition to land-based runoffs, unsustainable fishing techniques also have devastating effects on coral reefs. Unsustainable fishing techniques can include things like the fishing of nearshore nurseries, indiscriminate fishing, such as the dragging of a net through the water, fishing spawning aggregations, large groups of breeding fish, the overfishing of large fish, and the leaving of marine debris, which can kill fish or damage the coral directly. Marine debris has a very obvious effect on the environment around it. When trash like old fishing gear, plastic bags, plastic bottles, or other things find their way into coral reefs, they can often physically damage them. They can do this a couple of ways. including snagging on corals and breaking them outright, or entangling them, blocking out sunlight. Overfishing is a common form of unsustainable fishing as well. Aside from the obvious devastation of biodiversity that comes with reducing species below replacement numbers, the coral itself is also affected. When overfishing occurs, it tends to deplete a large number of herbivorous fish. Once their numbers are reduced, species of algae that are normally grazed down by these fish are allowed to replicate at accelerated levels. Now, once this is allowed to occur, the algae begins reducing dissolved organic carbon in a similar process to what was described under land-based runoff. This kills the coral outright through the depletion of its sources of oxygen.
Species, whether it be animals or vegetation, are considered invasive if they are not originally from a specific area and were introduced through settlement or human release. These invasive species can have drastic effects on the native species and their homes. According to studies done by the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, also known by NOAA, non-indigenous species in the marine environment can alter community composition, reduce the abundance and diversity of native marine species, interfere with ecosystem function, alter habitats, disrupt commercial and recreational activities, and in some instances cause extinctions of indigenous plants and animals. All this can happen by overpopulation or the non-indigenous species causing high resource competition for food and habitat and predation of these indigenous species. Once these non-indigenous species are introduced, it is extremely hard to eradicate them. Two of the most well-known invasive species in the Florida coastal waters are the lionfish and the Asian green mussel, but others also exist like the red sea goddess and the orange cup coral. Lionfish currently reside in Florida's saltwater coastlines, although native to the South Pacific and Indian Oceans. The lionfish was first detected in Florida in the mid-1980s and has drastically increased in the last 15 years. The major cause of the introduction of these lionfish into Florida waters have been believed to be due to the release of pets from aquarium hobbyists. These lionfish have detrimental effects on the well-being of native fish and coral populations. Researchers have discovered that a single lionfish residing on a coral reef can reduce recruitment of native reef fish by 79%. They also eliminate the herbivores that eat algae off the corals, causing stress to them and potentially killing off the corals. The other common invasive species invading the coastal waters of Florida are the Asian green mussels. They were first observed in the 1990s in the Caribbean and then 10 years later spreading to the coast of Jamaica, Venezuela, and the Tampa Bay area. Since 1999, populations in the Tampa Bay area have increased dramatically due to what is believed to be settlement and reproduction. Settlement is thought to have occurred by the mussels attaching themselves to the hulls of ships and traveling along with them. They have been known to displace native oyster reefs and clogging nearby filters of electrical plants, deeming them inoperable. Even though native species like blue crabs and sheepsheads feed on these mussels, it is not enough to lower their population. Not of increased concern but still being observed is the red-tipped sea goddess, a type of sea slug. Originally native to the tropical Pacific waters, they have found their way into the waters on the Florida Keys. Although increasingly abundant in various habitats, it is still unknown whether they are causing threats to native species. Likewise, the population of orange cup coral has also been expanded since it was first observed on the shores of Key Largo in 1999. These corals are native to the Indo-Pacific waters, but have been confined to artificial substrates in the Florida waters. They have been observed to aggressively compete for habitat space with native species, so they are currently being studied and monitored. Conservation efforts to reduce the population of these invasive species have been set forward by organizations like NOAA. NOAA has partnered up with Coral Reef Conservation Program to work on coral reef issues. These efforts discussed in the conservation programs include things like removing aquatic life from any boat traveling to different waters On land, monitoring coral and aquatic life status and ecosystem health, and enforcing rules and regulations set to protect coral reefs.